Ceann Comhairle, and Taoiseach, the very fact that nurses and midwives are again today engaged in industrial action is a reflection of your incompetence and your absolute failure, and a failure of your government to address the recruitment and retention crisis gripping the health service, but also your absolute inability, your utter incompetence in terms of gripping what is now a national crisis. It's not good for taxpayers that nurses and midwives are on picket lines. Had that occurred to you? It's not good for citizens, it's not good for anyone who relies on the services, and it's certainly not good for the nurses and midwives themselves. I spoke to many of them this morning at Holles Street and at St James's. I was there to demonstrate solidarity, but more importantly, to listen to what they have to say. And none of them wanted to be on the picket line, Taoiseach. They are very angry, they are very upset, they are very determined. They want to be back at work doing what they do best, that is caring for their patients. They are, after all, we agreed, the backbone of the health service. They do, after all, work in very, very difficult and very stressful circumstances and conditions. And the reality is, Taoiseach, no matter which way you try to spin it, is that their pay and their working conditions have given rise to a recruitment and a retention crisis within the system. I spoke with one midwife this morning who gave an example of just how broken the system is. She works in Holles Street. On one particular day, she was the only midwife on a ward of 12 women. And there was a woman there who had just come from a C-section, and she needed help. She was in discomfort, but she told the story that this woman wouldn't press the bell and wouldn't look for the midwife's attention because she could see just how stressed the midwife was, just how chaotic the scene was. So what kind of a service is that, Taoiseach, that somebody in need of assistance would feel moved not to ask for help when lying in a hospital ward? It's unacceptable. Your so-called approach to the unions was not just discourteous, it was disrespectful, and it was utterly inept. All of the hallmarks of your mishandling of this scenario to date. You have now conceded the need for engagement. That's a start. What you now need to understand is the parameters of that engagement. The parameters must be no preconditions. The parameters must be a direct engagement by you as head of government. The parameters must be direct engagement with the nurses, the midwives and their unions. Nothing short of that is going to work. And if you are interested, Ceann Comhairle, if the Taoiseach is interested in resolving this dispute in the public interest, you will engage directly. You will engage with no preconditions. You will step into the breach as head of government, and you will respectfully listen to the proposals coming from the nurses and their representatives, and then you will weigh them up, and if you're wise, you will act on them.
Taoiseach.
Deputy, we've had a system of resolving industrial relations disputes for 20 or 30 years now, including the last nursing strike, which went on for 9 days in 1999, something I don't want to see repeated. And that is that we deal with these disputes through the Workplace Relations Commission and through the Labour Court as the final arbiter in such disputes. And that is the best way to manage industrial relations disputes. It's worked for 20 or 30 years, and I have no doubt that it will resolve this dispute as well. And government and the various agencies of government are willing to engage through the WRC, as was offered yesterday, or through the Labour Court, should the Labour Court determine that an intervention is appropriate. In relation to recruitment and retention, as I've said before, I acknowledge that that is a real issue. It's a real issue in large parts of the public sector now, in large parts of the private sector now, as we approach full employment. And as the Nurses Union has said themselves, when it comes to healthcare, we live in a very competitive environment where people with healthcare degrees can work in almost any part of the world. Notwithstanding that, since we lifted the recruitment embargo 4 or 5 years ago, 3,500 more nurses are working in our health service, and that's a very significant increase. And in the last year alone, excluding students, about 800 more nurses and midwives working in our public service. So while there are plenty of people leaving, there are more coming home or coming in from other countries. While there are plenty of people leaving the profession, there are more coming into the profession. And our turnover rate of 5% is about a third of the turnover rate in Australia. But it is a struggle to recruit and retain. You'll know that we pay more than Northern Ireland, than Scotland and Wales, than most of the United Kingdom, with the exception of London. We pay more than most of Europe. All those places have recruitment and retention challenges. Other places pay more. Australia does pay more, and the United Emirates pays more as well. And those areas and those countries also struggle to recruit and need to recruit from all over the world. So unfortunately, there is no guarantee that an 8 or 9 or 10 or 12% pay rise will actually solve the recruitment and retention problem. It hasn't solved it for Australia. It hasn't solved it for the Middle East.
Well, Taoiseach, we're 2 days in and there's 7 days to go, and all you have to offer is robotic monologues. Nothing that you have said there has within it the seeds of resolving this dispute. What can resolve this dispute, and we have said this to you consistently, is positive, respectful, direct engagement. That is engagement with no threats or sabre rattling around pensions or pay, engagement with no preconditions, engagement not to carve up a special deal, but an engagement which the nurses and their representative bodies believe can be resolved within the strictures of the current public pay agreement. Now, I have said this to you several times on the floor of the Dáil. The nursing unions have said this to you publicly. I have no doubt anybody with an ounce of wit would give you the same advice privately, and yet you were unwilling as head of government to make the very necessary move. So let's be clear, Taoiseach, 2 days down, 7 days of action, of further action planned. And if this strike continues, the fault lies with you. The blame lies with your spectacular inertia and your refusal to act.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Deputy, listening to your contributions in this chamber and your advice on making agreements or managing industrial relations, you would be mistaken for thinking that somehow you were successful in this area. You and your party hold the record, the world record, for failing to come to an agreement and form a coalition in Northern Ireland. There is no advice. There is no advice you can give us on negotiations or conciliation or reconciliation that could possibly have any credibility, given your own record of being a commentator and a bystander in Northern Ireland when you should be involved in forming a coalition government there. But to repeat what I've said earlier, and I mean it sincerely, this dispute can be resolved. Government wants it to be resolved. We understand the grievances that nurses and midwives feel about their pay and terms and conditions. We understand the enormous public support that they have, and I believe they will continue to have. So government wants to resolve this dispute. We're willing to engage in talks in the WRC. We are willing to accept an intervention from the Labour Court if the Labour Court determines that advisable. And it can be resolved, but it has to be resolved under certain parameters that I think all sides should be able to accept. First, it has to be affordable for the taxpayer. We can't fund pay increases with borrowed money, particularly given the uncertainty ahead. And secondly, it has to be fair to all other public servants, the 300,000 public servants who work very hard, with whom we have a deal, and who are not on strike. And any pay issues have to be dealt with under the umbrella of ICTU and the Public Service Stability Agreement.